The dead of midnight on an August evening in 1953 enveloped Tehran in a dense, suffocating blanket. The narrow streets of the Iranian capital were deserted, save for the occasional patrols whose footsteps echoed from the stone walls. Down one such unlit street, an inconspicuous black car moved slowly, almost silently. In the back seat, huddled under a heavy wool blanket, hid a man whose decisions at that moment determined the fate of an entire state and the balance of power on the world stage. This man was Kermit Roosevelt, a high-ranking operative of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, grandson of the 26th American president. He was on his way to a secret meeting with the young Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In Roosevelt's briefcase, which he clutched tightly to his chest, lay not just documents. There was a meticulously developed plan, approved at the highest levels in Washington and London, to overthrow the legally elected Prime Minister of Iran. This plan, codenamed __0__, was intended to turn the tide of history in the Middle East, return control of vast reserves of black gold to Western corporations, and forever close off Soviet access to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. What began as a commercial dispute over oil wells was rapidly transforming into the first covert regime change operation in history, orchestrated by intelligence agencies during the Cold War. To understand how the American president's grandson ended up under a blanket in the Tehran night, one must rewind time a bit and travel to southern Iran, to the city of Abadan. It was there that the world's largest oil refinery was located, belonging to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. For decades, this corporation, whose controlling stake was in the hands of the British government, had been extracting millions of barrels of this precious resource from Iranian soil. Contracts, signed in the early 20th century under highly questionable circumstances, were structured in such a way that the lion's share of profits went to London, fueling the economy of the British Empire. The Iranian state received only crumbs from its own table, about 16% of the revenues, and even these figures were often subject to manipulation. British managers and engineers in Abadan lived in luxurious air-conditioned villas, played cricket on manicured lawns, and frequented exclusive clubs. At the same time, tens of thousands of Iranian workers huddled in slums without basic sanitation, electricity, or clean drinking water, receiving meager wages for their grueling labor. This blatant inequality had been building resentment in Iranian society for decades. Oil, which should have been a ticket to a prosperous future for an ancient nation, had become an instrument of its subjugation. It was on the wave of this popular indignation that Mohammad Mossadegh entered the political scene. A descendant of an ancient lineage, a brilliantly educated lawyer who earned a degree in Europe, he was a paradoxical figure. On the one hand, an aristocrat. On the other, a fiery tribune who knew how to speak to the crowd in its own language. Mossadegh was not a communist. He was a fierce nationalist, convinced that the country's sovereignty was inconceivable without control over its own natural resources. Having taken office as prime minister in the spring of 1951, he did what the entire country expected of him, but what the Western capitals could not believe until the very last moment. The Iranian parliament unanimously passed a law nationalizing the oil industry. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was stripped of its rights, and its assets came under the control of the specially created National Iranian Oil Company. For London, this was a shock and a direct challenge. The loss of the Abadan refinery not only meant a colossal financial blow to the British economy, which was still recovering from the global conflict of the 40s, but also irreparable damage to imperial prestige. The British government's response was a harsh, uncompromising economic blockade. Royal Navy warships blocked the Persian Gulf, threatening to intercept any tanker attempting to transport Iranian oil. On the international market, London initiated a global boycott. No major company dared to buy fuel from Tehran, fearing legal sanctions from British courts. British specialists left Abadan, taking technical documentation with them, which led to the shutdown of the complex equipment. Iran's economy, deprived of its main source of income, began to rapidly plunge into a deep crisis. Inflation skyrocketed, the state treasury was emptied, and payments to civil servants were delayed. British strategists were confident that economic strangulation would force Mossadegh to retreat in just a few months. They bet that poverty would spark riots that would sweep away the unyielding prime minister. However, they miscalculated in assessing their opponent's personality. Mossadegh proved unyielding. He severed diplomatic relations with Great Britain, expelled British diplomats from the country, and closed their embassy in Tehran, which traditionally served as the main center for intelligence gathering and influencing the local elite. Deprived of a legal residency, British intelligence realized that direct action was no longer possible. London recognized the need to enlist a powerful ally. The British cabinet's gaze turned to Washington. Initially, the United States of America maintained a neutral stance. President Harry Truman's administration did not want to get involved in the colonial disputes of the fading British Empire. American diplomats even tried to act as intermediaries, offering compromise options for profit distribution. Washington saw Mossadegh as a popular leader, capable of carrying out necessary reforms and creating a stable state that would serve as a reliable barrier against the spread of Soviet influence. However, the situation changed dramatically in the autumn of 1952, when a new administration led by Dwight Eisenhower came to power in the United States. Key positions in the new government were taken by the Dulles brothers. John Foster became Secretary of State, and Allen headed the Central Intelligence Agency. The Dulles brothers viewed the world exclusively through the prism of the global confrontation between the two superpowers. Any national liberation movement, any aspiration for independence from Western capital, was perceived by them as a potential threat and a possible springboard for Soviet expansion. British diplomats, realizing the shift in Washington's mood, ingeniously changed their rhetoric. They stopped complaining about the loss of oil revenues and began to actively play the Red Menace card. In secret memorandums sent to their American counterparts, London analysts painted grim pictures. They argued that the economic chaos in Iran, caused by the blockade, would inevitably lead to the collapse of the state apparatus. And in this power vacuum, the only organized force would be the Tudeh Party, a mass and well-disciplined Communist Party of Iran which had close ties with Moscow. If the Tudeh Party seized power, Iran, with its colossal resources and strategic position, would end up in the Soviet camp. Moreover, the Soviet Union would gain the long-awaited access to the ice-free ports of the Persian Gulf, which would fundamentally alter the entire geopolitical balance on the planet. This argument worked flawlessly. The fear of Soviet influence outweighed all doubts about Mossadegh's democratic legitimacy. In the spring of 1953, the plan for a joint British-American operation was finally approved. The Central Intelligence Agency was allocated a budget of $1 million, an enormous sum for covert operations at that time. Kermit Roosevelt, a man with an impeccable pedigree, a cold, analytical mind, and a penchant for risky ventures, was appointed to oversee the plan's implementation on the ground. The plan consisted of several interconnected elements aimed at destabilizing the situation in the country and creating an artificial crisis. The first task was psychological pressure on the Prime Minister and discrediting him in the eyes of various segments of society. Huge financial resources were put into play. Agents of Western intelligence services, through proxies, began to massively buy off politicians, members of parliament, newspaper editors, and influential Islamic theologians. The Iranian information space was flooded with fake news. Foreign-funded newspapers daily published caricatures of Mossadegh, accusing him of corruption, incompetence, secret ties with communists, and an intention to destroy the foundations of the Islamic religion. Articles written at the headquarters of Western intelligence agencies were translated into Persian and presented as the opinion of independent Iranian journalists. Concurrently, a second, even more cynical part of the plan unfolded: a false flag operation. The task was to create the appearance that the two-day Communist Party was practically seizing power with the connivance of the Prime Minister. Provocateurs hired by intelligence services, posing as two-day party supporters, took to the streets of Tehran. They shouted radical slogans, smashed shop windows in prestigious areas, instigated brawls with the police, and, most importantly, publicly insulted religious figures. These carefully orchestrated acts of vandalism were broadcast through controlled newspapers as evidence of an impending communist terror. The goal was crystal clear: to frighten the middle class, bazaar merchants, army brass, and clergy, making them believe that only the removal of Mossadegh could save the country from chaos and Soviet domination. However, to give the coup an appearance of legality, the participation of a key figure was required: Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. According to the Constitution, the monarch had the right to appoint and dismiss the Prime Minister, although in practice, this right had not been exercised without the consent of Parliament for a long time. The plan was to force the Shah to sign secret decrees, firmans. One firman removed Mossadegh from office. The other appointed General Fazlollah Zahedi in his place, a tough military man loyal to Western interests and ready to use force. But the Shah hesitated. He was young, indecisive, and panically afraid of his popular Prime Minister. Mohammad Reza understood that if the plan failed, he would lose his crown and be forced to leave his homeland forever. This is why Kermit Roosevelt found himself in that stuffy car on a hot August night. For several weeks he had been conducting secret negotiations with the monarch, alternating persuasion with direct blackmail. Roosevelt made it clear that if the Shah did not sign the documents, Western powers would turn away from him, and he would be left alone to face the impending catastrophe. As additional pressure, emissaries were sent to Europe to the Shah's sister, Princess Ashraf, known for her strong will. She was given large sums of money and convinced to return to Tehran to influence her indecisive brother. In the end, under pressure from all sides, in a state of extreme nervous tension, the Shah signed the necessary firmans and immediately flew to the north of the country, to the Caspian Sea coast, to be away from the capital at the moment the operation began. It seemed the mechanism was engaged, and everything was going according to plan. On the night of August 16th, Imperial Guard Commander Colonel Nasiri, accompanied by armored vehicles, arrived at Mossadegh's residence to present him with a decree of dismissal and take him into custody. But something unforeseen happened here. Mossadegh also had his own intelligence network. A few hours before the guard's arrival, he received a warning about the impending conspiracy. When Nasiri approached the residence gates, troops loyal to the Prime Minister were already waiting for him. The colonel was immediately disarmed and sent to a cell. In the morning, state radio announced the prevention of an attempted military coup. This news came like a bolt from the blue. Upon learning of the night's failure, the Shah, in a panic, boarded his private plane and fled the country. first to Baghdad, then to Rome, fully convinced that his reign was over forever. In Tehran, jubilant crowds of Mossadegh's supporters took to the squares. They toppled statues of the Shah and his father, tore down signs with street names bearing the ruling dynasty's name. The prime minister felt like a triumphant victor. It seemed to him that the danger had passed, the enemies were defeated, and the people were entirely on his side. At this moment, Mossadegh made a fatal mistake. Believing in a final victory, he ordered his supporters to go home and demanded that the police restore order to the streets, aiming to show that he controlled the situation and did not need the support of radical masses. Meanwhile, an atmosphere of despondency reigned at the United States Embassy. An urgent cipher message arrived from Washington. Immediately cease the operation, destroy all incriminating materials, and prepare for agent evacuation. The leadership in America decided that the game was lost, and further actions could lead to a catastrophic international scandal. But Kermit Roosevelt made an unprecedented decision. He ignored the direct order from his superiors. Assessing the situation, he realized that Mossadegh, by removing his supporters from the streets, was left defenseless. Roosevelt decided to improvise and play his last trump card. August 19th arrived, a day that forever changed the region's political landscape. From early morning, a network of mercenaries went into action. From the southern, impoverished districts of Tehran, from the territory of the enormous capital bazaar, organized groups of strong men began to advance. These were fighters from traditional sports clubs, criminal elements, street vendors, generously paid with cash dollars from secret intelligence funds. Led by the well-known city authority, Shaban Jafari, these crowds moved towards the city center. They marched not with political slogans but with clubs, iron rods, and knives. Soon they were joined by groups of soldiers who had defected to the conspirators' side after receiving generous rewards. Concurrently, the propaganda machine went into overdrive. Newspapers controlled by agents came out with huge headlines, publishing copies of the decrees signed by the Shah dismissing Mossadegh. A radio station broadcasting British news in Persian transmitted prearranged code phrases, signaling loyal officers in the provinces. Chaos intensified with every passing minute. An artificially created mob began to smash the offices of pro-government newspapers and the headquarters of political parties supporting the prime minister. The police, confused by conflicting orders and seeing the growing power of the rebels, began to give way, and in many cases defected to their side. The climax of events unfolded around Mossadegh's residence. By midday, the building was surrounded by a massive, aggressive crowd and approaching army units with tanks. The prime minister's guard, consisting of several hundred loyal soldiers, found itself completely encircled. A multi-hour assault began. Heavy equipment methodically destroyed the residence walls, and shells pierced the roof. The defenders resisted desperately, understanding there was nowhere to retreat. The roar of cannons merged with the furious shouts of the crowd. Inside the collapsing house, the elderly Mossadegh, dressed in his famous pajamas, in which he often received foreign diplomats, refused to leave the building, wishing to share the fate of his government. Only at the very last moment, when the main doors had already been broken down, his close associates managed to literally force the prime minister through a breach in the back wall into an adjacent courtyard. When the crowd burst into the residence, it began to methodically destroy everything inside, carrying out furniture, documents, and personal belongings. Tehran's state radio suddenly interrupted its broadcasts. After a few minutes of silence, the triumphant voice of General Zahedi sounded on the air, announcing that the Shah's legitimate authority had been restored and the government of usurpers had fallen. In Rome, in the luxurious hotel lobby, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, upon hearing the news from reporters, could not hold back tears of relief. He realized that he was returning home not as an exile, but as an absolute monarch. The operation was completed. Mossadegh was soon arrested, brought before a military tribunal, and sentenced to 3 years of solitary confinement, after which he spent the remainder of his days under strict house arrest in his village, deprived of the right to communicate with the outside world. The oil crisis was promptly resolved. Western corporations returned to Iran, forming a new international consortium that took control of hydrocarbon production. The United States of America received its share of the oil pie, and the British saved face, although their monopoly was irrevocably lost. The Shah, feeling the enormous support of Western powers, began to systematically clear the political field. A powerful and brutal internal security service, known as SAVAK, was created. Any dissent, any opposition activity was harshly suppressed. Thousands of two-day party members and nationalist supporters ended up in prisons. From a tactical point of view, the operation looked like a phenomenal, unconditional success for the organizers. For a negligible sum of $1 million by geopolitical standards, without an official introduction of troops or a declaration of war, it was possible to change the political course of a key Middle Eastern state. The threat of Soviet influence was eliminated right at the borders of the Soviet Union. Control over a strategically important resource was restored. In the corridors of Washington and London, operatives received congratulations, and the very scheme of secretly overthrowing undesirable governments through bribery, propaganda, and artificially created crises came to be considered a brilliant template for future actions in other regions of the world. However, if one looks at these events through the prism of historical time, the picture changes dramatically. By eliminating legal, secular, and democratic opposition, Western powers themselves destroyed the mechanism of legal political dialogue in Iran. Deprived of the opportunity to express their views through parliament and the press, Iranians began to look for other ways of resistance. The only place that remained outside the complete control of state special services was the mosques. It was there, in the silence of religious institutions, that a new, much more radical protest began to accumulate. The feeling of deep injustice, national humiliation, and the realization that the monarch was merely a puppet in the hands of foreign powers became deeply rooted in the public consciousness. A quarter of a century later, this hidden tension would erupt with such force that neither the Shah's million-strong army nor the support of foreign allies would be able to contain it. The fall of the monarchy and the establishment of a completely new, uncompromising system of coordinates in the Middle East would become a direct, inevitable consequence of the events of that hot August. External intervention, conceived as a means of preventing the radicalization of the region, ultimately became the main catalyst for this radicalization itself. The paradox of history lies in the fact that the desire to secure oil flows and stop the spread of one ideology led to the birth of a completely new force that changed the global political landscape beyond recognition. And then, in August 1953, when the dust settled on the ruined walls of the Prime Minister's residence, few could look so far ahead. The streets of Tehran slowly returned to their usual rhythm of life. Traces of destruction were hastily removed. Secret couriers delivered the last envelopes with banknotes to those who helped accomplish the plan. In the embassies, cryptographers sent final reports on the successfully completed mission. And somewhere in the quiet of the offices, among the dry lines of reports, the shadow of a black car gliding through the night streets, and the man with a briefcase, whose actions launched a mechanism whose echo resounds deafeningly in world politics to this day, was forever lost. The experience of this intervention became a harsh reminder that short-term tactical victories, achieved through manipulation and deception, are capable of laying the foundation for grandiose strategic catastrophes of future decades. The lessons of the past remain hidden until the consequences of forgotten decisions begin to knock on the doors of the present.